Good afternoon. I'm Kirk Williamson, president of the Columbia Basin Badger Club. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this important Badger Forum, particularly those of you who are not familiar with the Badger Club. We held our first Badger Forum in 2008 with one simple idea: provide a public forum for civil discussion of important topics of the day. And we're still going strong. Check out the calendar of upcoming events on our website at www.columbiabasinbadgers.com. That's Badgers with an S. Our programs wouldn't be possible without the efforts of dozens of dedicated volunteers and our sponsor partners, the Tri-City Herald, Tri-Cities Journal of Business, and Mid-Columbia Libraries. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's Badger Forum, Elizabeth Van Clark, who is a member of our board of directors and one of those ever important volunteers. Liz?
Thank you, Kirk. The phrase local control is often used in discussion of public school educational policies that influence our curriculum selections, our staff training, our district and building procedures and policies, and the local response to the state mandates regarding COVID. The term is also used when we discuss vouchers, charter schools, and private schools. Politicians, educational advocates, parents, and other members of the community often call for local control in education. But what does that really mean in actual practice? It's subject to a great deal of debate. There's currently misunderstanding about what decisions the state policymakers have control of and what decisions are responsibilities of the local educational policymakers. When considering local control and decision-making, various factors need to be considered, such as who makes these decisions locally and what are the impacts of those decisions be? Depending on the answer to those questions, local control of every decision without state guidance may be detrimental to students and our families. And as we've seen, state educational mandates and laws aren't always in alignment with our community's needs and values. Also, state control of education varies widely across our country, with some retaining more control than others. That brings us to the subject of today's Badger Club program. What does it mean to have local control of educational decisions in Washington State? To help us sort that out, we turn to our two acknowledged experts. Lee Finna is the director of the Center of Education at Washington Policy Center. She is the author of An Option for Learning, an assessment of student achievement in charter public schools, which in 2011 reignited the charter school debate in Washington State. She's the author of Washington Policy Center's widely read educational blog and Washington Policy Center's Education Reform Plan, 8 Practical Ways to Improve Public Schools. Lee holds a law degree from Boston University School of Law and a Bachelor's of Arts from Wellesley College. She's retired from her law practice to raise 2 children and work as business partner for a small business she owns with her husband. Tim Garshaw became executive director of Washington State School Directors Association, also known as WSSDA or WASDA, in 2016. Before coming to WASDA, Tim was the superintendent of the Rainier School District in Thurston County for 6 years. He also served as superintendent and principal of the Southside School District in Mason County. He began his teaching career in special education, 6th grade, and science in the Peninsula and Sumner school districts. He holds a BA from Pacific Lutheran University and an ME from City University of Seattle. He also received his superintendent certification from Washington State University. Tim is an avid sailor who races in waters as diverse as the Puget Sound and the Pacific Ocean of Northern California. If you have questions for our speakers during the presentations, please type them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and they will be relayed to me. As it's been agreed that Lee will go first, I am pleased to introduce you to Lee Finna.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I've been the director for education at the Washington Policy Center now for over a decade, and I've followed very closely developments at the state and local level on education policy. And we strongly support local control in favor of parent engagement and involvement. And we want school board directors to be listening and attentive to the needs of their community. And we would add another element to this discussion, and that is more and more states, 32 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico are now passing programs to give to parents that want it access to resources so they can send their children to, so they can hire tutors, so they can homeschool their children, so they can pay private school tuition. And that is similar to what we do in higher education, where we provide direct assistance to parents, access to resources so that they need to get their children educated. So with all the news that's coming out, the bad news about the public schools, closing them down for 2 years, imposing mandates from on high on the local districts, we're finding that other states are expanding options for families, giving direct assistance to families so they can take on the responsibility of educating their children themselves. And that's what I'm here to talk about. I can certainly discuss any specific questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Leave. Tim?
Sure. In interest of introduction, thank you for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with all of you today. I'm the executive director for WASDA, and WASDA is a state agency. We're in a coaching role more than a referee role. So we have no regulatory authority, but we're in a supportive role for school directors in Washington state. There are 1,477 public school directors in 295 districts, serving about 1.2 million kids. So here at WASDA, we believe that parents and families always have been and always will be a child's first educator. And so we have multiple model policies, positions in WASDA that support family engagement. There's a laundry list of RCWs that guide model policy development, that districts that outline parent and family engagement, also local control. And local control, I appreciate you taking up this topic because it can be a challenge, right? So for example, I use the school buses at railroad crossing example. So there's no shortage, or there's no surprise that there's a shortage of school bus drivers right now. I think you see that in all communities, and we need to get students to and from school safely. So with a shortage of bus drivers and longer bus routes, there aren't toilets on school buses. So some bus routes are over an hour, and that could be a problem. So in looking for a solution to that, districts that have an exorbitant number of railroad crossings, there's a law. All school buses must come to a complete stop before crossing a railroad track. That's a Department of Transportation regulation. And a district does not have the local control to go ahead and cross those railroad tracks and not follow that state guidance because it's in place for safety, even though if you could cut 7 minutes out of your bus routes. So I use that as an example because it's rather benign to let people understand that difference in local control versus state control. There are many topics that have been at the forefront of discussion in communities around response to COVID. And those are important discussions. And so thank you for having us here so we can get to the bottom of some of this and where local control falls to local school boards and where sometimes it's a state decision. And also, if it is a state decision and we don't like it, as elected officials, we can advocate to change that state decision. We can advocate with our local lawmakers to change that rule that may fall outside of our purview as local school districts.
Thank you, Tim. We're going to turn to questions from the audience. We are pleased to have viewers from throughout the region. We'll get to as many of them as possible in the time we have. Since I have the virtual floor, I'm going to ask the first question. And either of you are welcome to start with it, but I would love to hear from both of you. Do you feel that we have in Washington state a good balance between local and state control? And either which way, how would you like to see that balance shifted or adjusted for the betterment of our communities?
Lieb, do you want to go first?
Sure. I can say that the concept of local school boards having local control may have been true 100 years ago when our communities were much smaller. There are many more school districts, and local parents actually could get on school boards and direct what is taught the children and hire the teachers. And in the 100 years since many of our districts were consolidated into bigger districts and our population has grown, the the number of entities that have asserted control over public education has also increased and moved control away from local districts to the state, to the federal government. And so we see this as a feature of the monopoly schools that have a guaranteed income stream that has literally no competition. 90% of the students in this country and in Washington state are assigned to a government public school by a zip code. And parents have very little control over what is taught their children. They must mount a political campaign to get a slate of school board directors that are in line with their views to get to assert some control. So I think the system is actually broken. We would support reforms, as I mentioned, that would remove control away from the state, away from the federal government, back to the kitchen table. The parents who love their child, who care about the fact that COVID now has shown a dramatic harm to the education of the children inflicted by the closed schools for 2 years. There were just the NAEP test scores, the nation's report card results just came out showing that Washington's kids have lost up to a year of math instruction and are falling behind. And so I would say we don't have time to reform the system of public education and put pressure on our state lawmakers to improve the imbalance of control that it's just not going to happen in time fast enough to help families who have the urgency of educating their child right now. They have a child who is 5 or 6 or 7 years old, or 10 or 12 or 13 years old, and that child is now behind in reading and math. And what we suggest is that we help the families by taking some of the unspent COVID relief funds. $1.6 billion is sitting in the bank accounts of our school districts across Washington state. Today, there was a Seattle Times editorial that said only 9% was being spent on tutoring. And what's going on? Why don't we give that money directly to families so they can hire tutors to help their kids catch up? That would be a form of local control that I would support.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is that we're definitely out of balance and there needs to be more of a shift and some strategies for doing that.
So I would agree and disagree in certain of those points. Is there a good balance? It depends on what the topic is. So what I'm hearing from communities and from my board. So there are certain things that are decisions made at the state level that most people wouldn't change at the local level. You can't smoke on a public school campus, right? There's no more smoking in the teacher's lounge. My example about buses, those types of things. When it comes to instructional materials and curriculums, there's RCWs. 28A.320.230 outlines by law every school district when adopting core instructional materials has to have an instructional materials review committee, and it has to include parents and families and community members. So then if there are challenges to instructional materials that are being used or library books, things like that, the law clearly outlines required policies and procedures for districts to have that so that there is a path forward. I'm finding, talking with local school districts, and I'm out in the field in districts all across the state, that really we agree on far more than we disagree on. And the vast majority of things going on in public schools are things that we can support, but there's a handful of things that are polarizing and people feel passionately about on both sides. And that's where it's okay to disagree. It's okay to have civil discourse and get to the bottom of it so that we can reach a better solution. Now, COVID has been an extreme challenge. I can tell you, I meet with school boards every single day, and they feel the urgency to make up for that lost instructional time. They do. They're required to put together plans on how they're going to spend the COVID funding. A lot of those are long range. We know that to catch up and make up that difference, it's not going to happen in 30 or 60 or 90 days. And that's a tragedy. Those children need assistance. In doing that, districts are reaching out to their communities about what programs and supports can be there, but they also, with those funds, have a period of time to do that. How they spend those funds is local control. That's up to those districts, how they're choosing to use those funds. So that is a great example of where local control is in balance, rather than the state of the feds coming in and saying, you must have a reading program, you must offer X numbers of this or that, that does put in the hands of local elected school boards who are turning to their families for that. One other piece that is in this balance and dynamic between local control or state control, one of the things that I learned from my experience as a teacher, and this was back when learning standards were first coming to the state, and the state test was the WASL back then. It's had several different names throughout the years. Is this agreement that a one-shot assessment test like a NAEP or a WASL or an MSP or all of the others, Smarter Balanced, a one shot doesn't tell the whole picture. We know that. And there needs to be multiple tiers of intervention and support that go along with that. Now, when it comes to learning standards, what should be taught at each grade level, we've seen this movement over the last decades to statewide and national learning standards. And there can be debate, and there should be debate over what kids should be taught and what goes in those standards. But the value in that decision being made statewide is we have a highly mobile student population. We have families that follow harvest. We have families that work in the agricultural field. We have military families. We have families that are relocating for jobs in industry as it's popping up and communities are growing. And if a student is taught a unit on insects and invertebrates in second grade, but the following district teaches that in third grade, now that student, when they transfer to another school, is going to have a gap, or they're going to double up on something. That was the precipice for putting in learning standards, not how it should be taught, but what should kids learn at each grade level in the core academic areas so that all Washingtonians walking across the graduation stage will be prepared for life beyond the K-12 system. Now, with state level standards, that can provide a framework, but districts still have local control on the actual instructional materials they use. And that's where the law puts into play the instructional material committees. Family and parent voice is important. Community voice is important. Now, there are some areas, and in the sexual health area, for example, there have been all kinds of information that's put out there about what's going on in other states. Is this going on in your school? You need to ask. My advice is if you have a question about what's being taught, talk to the teacher, talk to the principal, ask to see the instructional materials. Families and parents have a right to see and review the instructional materials, and you also have a right to opt out of some of those. So I would focus attention. If you have concerns about what is actually being taught, get involved, volunteer for the committee, ask questions, review the materials, and focus on your school, your child's classroom, and what is actually happening. Because as we've seen on both sides of any issue that becomes contentious, one-off examples are oftentimes held up as the norm, and they're concerning. And people hear this example and they're concerned, is that happening in my school? So they go and find out.
Thank you. I actually had a question about the state control of the standards. What would you say to some parents who have expressed a concern that heavy focus on those state standards and those assessments have taken away from the support of our arts and our other classes, our arts and our theater and our music?
Sure. So my experience as a classroom teacher and in building level administration, I've seen the opposite. I've seen integration. We have seen some programs cut due to budget funding and things like that, and some budget concerns, but I've seen integration where in my last elementary school I worked in, the art teacher and the music teacher were having regular planning sessions with the math teacher and how is what's going on in one unit or one course of study supporting another. And so I've seen more of an integration out in the field. There is the concern about, are we teaching to a test? And I don't believe anybody should be teaching to a test, but there's difference between teaching to a test and teaching to a standard, such as by the end of third grade, children should know their times tables. That's whatever test measures that is one thing, but how you are determining each step along the way to get students to the skills that they need can provide a lot of local control. I mean, we have Aviation High School. We have Henrietta Lacks Biomedical High School. We have a Maritime High School. We have amazing programs that are going on in the Sumner School District, I was part of a science specialist program where kids received science as a specialty area in a science lab, and those are popping up around the state. So there's a lot of ability at a local district to do values-based budgeting, where your budget as a board aligns with the strategic plan that you created with your parent and family and community input to be able to have those innovations to meet the needs of the communities within those standards.
Liv, what do you think?
Well, I think that there is, listen to all of this excuse making. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I've heard so much of this in the past. The learning standards are going to raise the learning. We need to have uniform standards so the children can move from one district to another and know what they need to know to succeed. We were promised that the learning standards and the tests would raise all the children's learning academics. And now we see that on not just the NAEP test, but on the state test, 70% of the kids have failed to pass the state test in math, and 50% are failing to pass the state test in English.
And is
And
that
large-
the most recent assessment?
that was the one right after NAEP, right after the COVID school shutdown. And the most recent assessment shows 62% are failing in math and 49% are failing in reading. So we're talking about large numbers of children that are not meeting the basic standards set by the state that the state has promised us, and all the school district officials promise us the children are going to meet. And then they say it's a tragedy that they haven't met them, and that eventually the schools will use the money to help the kids get ahead. And we do have choice in this and that and the other. In Arizona, for example, a very different approach has been taken, that the governor there has passed a program called the Empowerment Scholarship Account that makes every family in the state eligible to receive in an account $7,000, which is 90% of the funding that the state provides to educate their child. And with that $7,000, they can leave the public school system and educate their child themselves by hiring tutors, by paying private school tuition, by homeschooling their children, and to bring them up to standard. So I think that's a much more, I mean, look at the endless number of controversies in public education. There's one argument after another. Now, the sex ed curriculum that is now being forced upon districts from the state, the critical race theory racism that has been forced by the state on school board directors, and all the teachers in our schools are being taught to teach that one race is an oppressor and another race is oppressed. It's terrible. And so we need to talk about all these things, and clearly there isn't sufficient local control if the state can force illegal policies upon every district, every.
That certainly sounds like another forum we'd have to have is digging into those. But I would like to take a question from one of our viewers along lines of, if all schooling is under parental control, be that homeschooling or our hybrids or our traditional brick and mortars, how would parents homeschool high school level physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics? And if we are teaching all of our children at home, how would we make sure that those classes are taught at a rigorous or sufficient academic level that our students can carry that knowledge successfully into college and the workplace?
Well, you would look at what happened during COVID. Parents had their schools closed down, and they formed these learning pods, and they got together with a group of friends, and they got professors of math teaching their kids math. They got professors of physics teaching their kids physics. Parents are very capable, and there's a lot of material online to help parents educate their children to the standard, the high school level. It's very possible. It occurs to me that I'm old enough to say that I was educated in a public school system that did not have learning standards. And I'd venture to guess that I have learned a lot more art and a lot more history and a lot more civics than the current group of students coming out of our schools today. So all of these top-down regulations trying to force a uniform, version of education does not necessarily result in better results, as the recent test scores show. So Have a little faith in parents. Look at the homeschooling population. They have the highest performing kids on the spelling bee. They go to college in much higher proportions than children graduating from our public school system. So the parents are fully capable of meeting the challenge of educating their children, but they need the resources, because the resources have been concentrated in this public education system. And I'm not talking about the whole system changing the funding. I'm just talking about those parents who are struggling, who are unhappy, those on the margins, who are not getting what they need out of the schools.
Okay, Tim, would you like to speak to that? Because we have a piece there about resources and the difference between resources when we're talking about public school versus our homeschooling.
Perfect, thank you. So if a family chooses to homeschool right now in pre-pandemic, they can partner with their school district to receive instructional materials. When I was a superintendent and a principal, we had some families that chose to homeschool, but their children would come in for 2 periods a day to access a science lab or physical education classes and things like that, where there was equipment necessary to do that. During the pandemic, our parents did their absolute best. They really did. I'd also like to say our teachers did their absolute best. It was incredibly difficult. We, in 72 hours, districts had to pivot from all of their lessons to how we deal with connectivity with laptops out there. It was a horrific, ginormous task to do that. And in hindsight, were there things that could have been done better? Absolutely. The challenge here, and this is Tim Garshaw with his education experience, this is not the executive director of WASDA saying this. What we did as a state and as a nation is that we willingly advanced 100% of our the vast majority of our students to the next course of study, knowing they were not prepared, knowing that they did not receive the instruction. Now, the alternative to that some people proposed was, do we hold everybody back a year? I don't think that was a good solution either. So right now, where we're at is, how do we catch them up? How do we partner with parents? It's not an either or. How do we bring families and parents in, and how do we really get to the root of what is each child's need right now to get where they need to be, and how are we going to meet that need? So you have districts, for example, that started off this school year where 3 days before the start of the school year, they sat down with every parent or family of every student, and they talked about, okay, where are the gaps from last year? Where are the things that we need to do? And then they're taking that ESSER money, the COVID relief fund money, and they're coming up with differentiated instruction where there may be whole group instruction at grade level content and then small group instruction later in the day. Some of it's before and after school. Some districts are looking at rearranging their whole calendar to a balanced calendar approach to be able to maximize that intercession between grading periods so that kids, it's not the end of the year or the end of the semester when we realize that there are gaps. So people are being incredibly innovative, and they're doing it with their families and with their communities and sitting down. The way to do this and make up for that lost instruction time is to focus on each individual each individual student and their needs.
Well, I'm glad you're admitting that the entire system socially promoted children to the next grade, knowing that they did not have the skills they needed to succeed in the next grade. I'm glad you're saying that, because that's an important thing to say.
I'm saying that we promoted them knowing that there were gaps in instruction.
Yes,
I think
yes,
we pretty much all knew that was going, because what was the option?
And today the Seattle Times reports that only 9% of the federal relief funding has been spent on individual tutoring, and also included in that 9% is social and emotional learning. So you don't really know how much has been spent on the private tutoring, individual tutoring of children to catch them up. So I am skeptical that this is happening on a broad scale, given that percentage. So,
I completely understand your skepticism. When school districts, when we talk about local control, if the state were to say 50% must be spent on tutoring, tutoring may not be the best approach for every student. It might be integrated instruction, small group instruction during the day at their zone of proximal development. So we have 100,000 or 90,000 teachers in the state, many of them with master's degrees, that spend all day, every day doing this. And we should trust that they understand the best approach to come through. if they're working with families and students like the districts who sat down to identify those needs. But I would be hesitant to put a funding and say a certain percent was spent on tutoring. Tutoring is not the end all. There could be a
Well-
lot of approaches. It should be a local
So-
approach to decision.
What I'm hearing is, Leave, is that you talk about shifting teaching, shifting education to kitchen tables, that $1.6 million that Washington has, that.
Billion.
Oh, I'm sorry, $1 billion dollars. That we want to see redistributed to education, specifically to families. What do we do though about those families who we have both parents or both guardians working? They really economically can't afford to stay home with their children. That's not really going to be a kitchen table to
Yes.
be able to educate kids at. So
Well, you give
what do we do about
those,
that?
well, you do what they're doing in Arizona and give those families $7,000 so they can put their child in a private school that actually individualizes the instruction of the child and helps them catch up in school in a way that the public school system does not operate in
How
this
would
way.
How would the structure of the private school be different from the structure of the public school?
The private schools are much more flexible and nimble and able to take a child out of a class and say, let's test you and see where you are. Let's catch you up to where you need to be. The public school system is laden down with rules and regulations, collective bargaining agreements with teachers' unions and the like that prevent teachers from working after school to catch kids up. The system demand any kind of change from the established one-size-fits-all program that moves kids from grade to grade, knowing that they're going to fail because they don't have the skills they're going to succeed in the next year, is not set up to individualizing instruction. It's set up to move kids through the system to graduate them without the knowledge they need. We have an education emergency in Washington State. No one is talking about it. The state superintendent of public instruction is trying to ignore these deplorable test results. The test scores are numerous tests are showing that the kids are behind, and the system is not doing anything on a grand scale. So you have to help the families by giving them the resources they need to catch their kids up themselves.
I certainly agree with that. We can't argue too terribly much with the data. And I've spoken to teachers who have said about the same thing about our struggles. But when I'm thinking about it is the private schools, you said they aren't as bound by those regulations. So that to me sounds like perhaps an issue with the way our state regulations are written, that the private schools are not bound by them. But
Well,
the
Liz,
public schools
I
are.
would.
Yes,
I would
yes,
offer-
Okay. Sorry, Leave. Tim, if you've got a piece to put in there.
Good, thank you. I would offer anyone who's concerned about a public school's ability to provide intervention for a student to meet their needs, ask your local school about MTSS, multiple tiers of student support. So that is something that districts around the state have been looking at. As far as, and it's not a one size fits all. Districts take a look at that. What are the multiple supports we have in place for our students? I have not been to a district either as an employee or visiting or out in the field where that district felt that they were prohibited by a state regulation from doing a formative assessment of a student, a little 2-minute formative assessment. We went over this concept last week. We're going to do a 2-minute pop quiz with the kids. Those that got it are going to go on to here to this enrichment. Those that didn't, for the next hour, we're going to go back and teach it in a different way. So that type of innovation is going on. So I would ask, rather than, if you're in the audience, rather than take the word of me or anyone else on the call, go to your local school and just say, hey, what is this MTSS and what supports do you have for students who are struggling, and see what's available. You might be surprised. There's some great innovation going out there.
And see how far you get. I mean, see how far you get. If you have a child who is behind and you go to your local school district and you're teaching and you say, this child needs to be assessed and been given special tutoring help until he catches up in math and reading, see how far you get with your local school district. You are not going to get very far. Notice the language that's being used, multiple systems of support. I mean, districts have been looking at it. You have a very passive way of describing a government monopoly that has failed the kids of
I'm so
Washington
sorry.
State. So I just do not trust, the data is not showing that the schools are catching kids up. And there's been alarm bells being raised by researchers from Harvard. Harvard, Stanford had a Zoom call last Friday morning saying, this is an emergency. The children are going to lose out on their long-term opportunities in life. They will not get into college. They will not get into good careers. They're going to suffer from their earnings. $1 trillion, just reading an article yesterday from the 74 million newspaper, $1 trillion in lost earnings because the children are being moved through the system without the skills they're
So-
going to need to succeed.
But we're still coming back to the balance between the local and the state control. And if we shift everything into a kitchen table, how do we meet those students' learning needs? And yes, parents are very, we're some serious problem solvers. I did that for a couple of years too. Where are all those tutors though, and those teachers going to come from if this is happening at a kitchen table? Because they have to come from somewhere. If we're shifting students whose parents can't be home into a private school, then are our private schools well enough staffed? Do they actually have all the strategies needed to support all of our students, including our
Well, you'd
students with
be
disabilities?
surprised. You'd be surprised if you free up the resources and a market will emerge. That is the way the world works. This happened when we passed the charter school law. A lot of people said there are not going to be any charter schools in Washington. Nobody wants charter schools. And lo and behold, we had 35 groups, educator proposals, in the first year of the charter school law. So there's lots of responsiveness and ingenuity and energy around education. New private schools would pop up. Parents, imagine if you were a parent and had $7,000 and you got together with 10 or 12 of your friends, you could hire a teacher to educate your children. And you could have two parents working and let the teacher educate the children with this additional resources you'd have at your disposal. That the amount of money that the state, 90% of the money that the state is collecting to educate your child and not succeeding at educating your child. That's the point here.
So if we take a look at the challenge ahead of us, right, there is no doubt test scores are abysmal right now, and we're coming out of a time to where most students lost a significant portion of their instruction. Yes, that is a problem that needs to be handled. If you look at the impact on the system of $7,000 per student, it could go to families, 1.2 million kids. So when we look at that, that's $7 billion. And the question is, what about those students whose families work? What would that do to the system for the other kids? And if that's just for tutoring, so what happens if I have $7,000 to get tutoring over here, but then my child's education, there's fewer teachers, fewer staff, fewer support for interventions, fewer small reading groups, fewer opportunities for students, fewer career and technical ed courses, all of those types of things. A $7 billion hit to the system would leave gaping holes in the ability for districts to meet the needs of students, which the public education system is a constitutional right of every student. And so you can't take away that constitutional right or gut that constitutional right. What you can do is you can work with your local school district, see what's available. And if you don't get very far, then go to the principal. If you don't get far there, go to your school board. They're elected by you to make decisions of governance for your school. But
And when was the last time you went to your school board and got something through that you wanted? I mean,
I
let's
see
be
that happen
real.
every day.
So
Oh, I mean, look, let's talk about the money that's in the public schools. I looked it up for your area. There's the Pasco School District gets $15,900 per child, Richland $15,100, Kennewick $15,900 per child. A giving, and that's the total federal, state, and local funding. There is plenty of money in the public school system to give those who are unhappy, whose kids are struggling, a certain portion of that money so they can actually help their kids catch up. And all this, I've never seen, there's so much fear mongering around public education. It's like, oh, if we do things differently, this could happen or that could happen, or, oh my gosh, we could divert some of the funding away from the public education system. But the point is, we're trying to help kids get educated. Is that our first and foremost concern here? Or is it defending the system from change? That's what I hear. Oh, we can't have any change. Well,
Give you a
when we-
quick example with numbers and then move on really quickly. So if you take-
Yeah, I have another question I'd like to ask. Go ahead.
I'll be real quick. I'm sorry. When we take the total state and federal funding that comes in for special education, these are students with diagnosed learning disabilities that need additional support. We take the total funding that comes in. We take the latest information on what districts actually have to spend for that. It's a $400 million gap. So just to meet the constitutionally federally protected right to a free and appropriate public education for our students that are struggling the most, we have a $400 million gap already. So districts turn to local levies. They turn to other funds. They turn to their basic ed funding allocation. So I would flip the question around and say, what would it look like if instead we fully funded the research-based, federally protected, federally required supports for our struggling learners? What if we fully funded that and didn't need to rely on our local tax levies in order to meet that need? What would that do for supporting families and students as well?
So this Arizona bill that I told you about that has $7,000 per child, it would also add additional money for the special needs. If they have a special needs child, they would get the portion that the state spends on educating their special needs child. And in Washington state, that's nearly equal to, it's virtually the same. So the state provides about $12,500 per child if they're in the regular system. But if they're a special needs kid, each child would receive $25,000 per child. So if you had a special needs child in the system, 90% of that would be about $22,000. And I submit that a family with $22,000 in a special needs child could find the help that they need in the private sector and do better for the child than within the public school system, which is always saying it never has enough money, because there's no end to the imagination of the people within the schools for needs for more money. And look at these, we've doubled state
I'm
funding in
sorry, I'd like to
education.
move on to the next question if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Sorry.
There are lots of topics in here that would probably cover about 3 or 4 different forums, right?
Yeah.
There is a concern though that comes from some of our community members, and when we're talking about, so let's say the children that we're now sending to private school because perhaps public schools have been closed down, and would consider that local control. How do we then hold these schools accountable for making sure that they provide that constitutionally guaranteed right to equal educational opportunities? Like our students with disabilities, how do we make sure that the students going to those private schools or our minority students are getting provided that equitable education that's supposed to be guaranteed by the Constitution if we don't have any state control over that?
If you're asking me that question, in Arizona, for example, the parents absolve and release the state from educating their child. The state no longer plays a role in guaranteeing that. The parents assume that responsibility, and the state of Arizona and the governor and all the lawmakers there have signed on to the concept that parents will take on this responsibility and do a better job than the state if they wish to take this on. If they wish to stay within the public system and they're happy with it, there's no threat to the public system, because that public system gets more money every year. And so that is that's a false, a red herring that is always raised by the people who want more money for the public schools. It's not true. The public schools always get more money.
Leif, I'm not asking for more money from the public schools. I'm just saying,
Okay.
I have a child with special needs.
Yes.
And if I went by your plan and
Yes.
and sent my child to a private school using, let's say we got seven or 25,
$22,000.
sent my
Yeah.
child to private school using that funding, what's holding that school accountable to meet the needs of my child?
You are.
So
If
if
you-
they don't meet the needs of my disabled child, then what?
Then you can find another private school that is meeting their needs. So you would have the control over the resources, which would give you the power to do what is best for your child. If the private school you choose initially doesn't meet the needs of your child, you take it to another private school. Or if you prefer to stay in the public school, are you getting well served by the public school?
So
So
Liz,
it's-
if I could give an example. So I know some homeschool co-ops that do a phenomenal job. I do. And they partner and they do a good job. I also have experienced several cases, and it's not for a lack of passion or desire or trying, where some families have chosen to pull their kids out and homeschool or do a co-op or some other types of things. It didn't work out. And after a period of time, either it didn't work out or the student got to an age where they wanted to go back to a high school and have prom and homecoming and the social interactions, they came back. And when they came back, there were some gaps, and it wasn't for lack of trying. And then the school system is trying in the last 4 years out of 13 of education to fill those gaps and prepare them to meet graduation requirements and be prepared. And how you define prepared can look a lot differently, but the state defines it as college and career ready. And so that could be a challenge. If in the Arizona model, if a family says, well, I'll sign off that I won't hold the state accountable, that's fine, but that doesn't prohibit them 3 years later from coming back and saying, this isn't working, and I'm going to enroll my student back in my neighborhood school 3 years down the road. And now the system absorbs that as well. So it can be a challenge. I'm not saying it can't be done right. And parents, lots of parents homeschool their kids and they do a really good job. But I've also experienced other situations where it wasn't. And you're right, Liz, about the accountability piece. What if there's a discrepancy on IEP services where a family comes in with an independent evaluation and they're requesting a service, and a private school says, well, it's just not in the budget, we can't afford it, or for some reason they're not going to do it, and then you go to challenge that. Does a family have the same right to go to the education ombuds or to OCR at OSPI or file a complaint? That's not something I know how to answer. I don't have the answer to that, but you're right to bring up the fact about parents need accountability in the system as well for who's delivering the instruction.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. You make a very interesting point there, Tim. You're supporting what I'm saying is that, yeah, sure. Let's suggest, look at this. We could have the public school system with its system in place for meeting the needs of special ed children, with IEPs and all the regulatory burden that comes with that. And we let that stay in place. But then if a family like Liz's family is not happy with the services the district has provided, they can take their money and go see if they can do better in a private system. And I think and if she is unhappy there, she can come back to the public system. I mean, this puts her in the position of deciding, not some official in a central bureaucracy that doesn't really care about her child. It's her, Liz, the mother and the father who decides what the best fit is for the child. And that is the vision here that we're talking about. And it's also been shown to improve the performance of the public school system, because the performance of the public school system has no competition. It has guaranteed income stream. It doesn't have to meet the needs of a child. They can deny Liz's child the services they're entitled to, and she has to take them to court. I've heard about this many times. Special needs families having to hire lawyers to get the school districts to provide them the guaranteed, the federally guaranteed special ed program that they're entitled to get. They have to hire lawyers. Well, that's ridiculous. They should give them the money that the state provides to educate their child and see if they can do better in the private sector. And that will improve the responsiveness of the public system to families like Liz's.
I think the challenge is when we hold up a highly impactful but lower probability situation as an example. Yes, there are families that have had to sue school districts, and that's a shame, and they shouldn't have had to. But the number of families in that situation, we hold that up as the example to justify a different system that would remove $7 billion and leave, you just said, keep all the special ed stuff in the public school and let the families who are actively engaged take the $7 billion out of the system and homeschool or do something else there. That will diminish the ability of the school district to do that. And then we create public schools that are remediation based.
No, but you're exaggerating. First of all, let's talk about the $7 billion. There's a proposal before the state legislature introduced by Representative Jim Walsh to give families $10,000 per student to educate their children. And the first 100,000 families would be eligible. That would take $1 billion out of the public school system that spends $18.5 billion per year. That is certainly affordable within the system. That would give 10% of the families who are unhappy an option to educate their children in the private sector. That seems to me be a very reasonable way to help parents have more power over the education of their children, and to give the public schools a signal. We are not accepting this failure across the board of all the promises that you make that you're going to educate our children and meet the learning standards and have them pass state tests. This will send a signal. If a certain percentage of parents, 100,000, can leave and go elsewhere, the public school system will start to reform itself from within. Right now, nothing can be done. Top-down reforms have failed over and over again. We've had 40 years of failed education reforms. So this is why this is a new way of thinking about it. This is the way to improve the schools, is to give families options within the monopoly and outside the monopoly. And that will improve the monopoly's performance and help
So
individual families.
when we
And I would
first started this forum, Levi, you were talking about just collapsing public education entirely and taking it all back to the kitchen table. What I'm hearing, though, in the midst of this dialogue is that really we need more of a wider choice. We certainly do need the public education system along with other choices, but resources are an issue. And potentially the way our state legislates education is an issue.
What are you
So-
saying? What's your question, Liz? I don't quite understand it.
Liz, I would argue that the path forward here is to embrace best practices and open up more channels for family and engagement and involvement. Recently, WASDA had a General Assembly, and at our General Assembly, our members, all the school districts in the state, they vote on positions. Those positions are written and proposed by school board members. So it's very similar to how a bill becomes a law. A group of elected officials come up with an idea, they put it in writing, they debate it, they amend it, they vote on it. It's a democracy, majority rules. The difference is that when the legislature passes an idea, it's a bill and all Washingtonians must comply. When WASDA passes a position, it is an advocacy position, but nothing binds a school district to advocating for it. They can advocate with their local legislators, with all legislators, in contrary to that position if they want to. And then each year they can be amended and moved on. This year, we had a position come forward. It was position 61 on parents as stakeholders and families as stakeholders. Great idea. I don't think anybody argued with the concept. But we have 200 positions. And so we have a committee that works on streamlining them so that instead of having 5 positions on special ed, you take the content of all of that into one position, right? So they recommended a do not pass of the new position because the content existed in 2 other areas. Well, in the democratic process, the members, the voting delegates of all the districts, they debated it, they extended debate, they went back and forth, and ultimately, they took a vote and it passed because the elected officials, using democracy, said, okay, we are okay. We understand it's redundant and over here as well, but we believe enough in parent and family involvement that we're okay having multiple positions on this at this time. And so it passed. So in that, once WASDA positions pass, then we advocate, we build materials out. And I've got to tell you, I think the path forward here is parent-family involvement at the local level. If you've got questions about what's being taught, reach out. If your kid needs help, reach out. If your child needs help and you're not getting a reaction from the school district, then get a hold of somebody. Get a hold of me. I can point you in the directions of who you can call. You can call the ombuds. You can call OSBI. There's a lot of things that you can do. And I understand that people have had bad experiences with all of those. We've all had bad experiences. I've had bad experiences at retail outlets, with companies, private, public, all of those things. But really, we need to get back down to, let's talk about the things that we are for, not the things that we are against. And the list with families, parents, community members, school directors, staff, legislators, if we really look at the list of things that we are for, it will be far greater than the list of things that we are against.
Okay.
Well, let me just say, parental involvement requires giving parents some actual power in the system. They have no power. If COVID showed us anything, the parents were unable to reopen the schools during the 2-year shutdown. And that tells you something very important, that you can pass all kinds of resolutions in your legislative assembly, and you can make lip service to parental involvement, but until you actually give parents control over a portion of the dollars that the state provides to educate their children, they will be pushed aside, and the more powerful special interest in education will succeed. And we will continue to see these terrible test scores, and children's futures will continue to be harmed because this system is not set up and does not and has failed the public and needs a different option to restore the imbalance of power. There is no local control of the kitchen table. It's all at the state and district level, and we need to rebalance the lack of control that parents have.
Thank you very much. We are in our last 5 minutes. I really appreciate both of you coming on, talking about this really passionate topic that has a lot of details to it, and certainly needs probably a split apart and a deep dive where we just talk about funding and structure and state laws as separate. So I want to thank you for your time on this. Since we are in our last 4 to 5 minutes, if you have just a couple minutes, kind of closing comments, and then I'll be turning the program back over to Kirk Williamson.
Sure. Lee, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Look, we strongly support parental involvement. We support the public schools. We want them to be fully funded. We want everyone to be treated properly within the system. But we have seen from our research that parents have no power in the system of schools. And now we have an education crisis, and individual children are falling behind. So we say, introduce a new element, give parents an option, let them go, let a certain number of parents who are really unhappy and not being well served to have access to actual dollars so they can find help in the private sector. And that would allow us to expand the program of public education to include the private sector. This happens across Europe. This happens in many countries it happens in 32 states and Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. Why not give parents this option by giving them control over a portion of the money that they provide to pay their taxes with, so they can move their individual child through? And that's just what we're proposing as an idea.
I'd like to close with some advice about when something is local decision, local control, or state control. During the pandemic, I was in many meetings with decision makers, with the governor's office, with OSPI, with the Department of Health. I did not have a vote. WASDA didn't have a say in the outcome, but once decisions were made, we were the conduit to get those decisions out. And so a lot of people were angry that we were mandating masks or vaccines. WASDA did not mandate any of that. We didn't have any positions on that. We were a conduit of the rules as they were changing. So in that process, though, a lot of people, board members and community members, were upset. They didn't like what was being required or mandated. So what local school boards did is they took the voice of the community. They said, okay, we're told that this isn't our decision, but let's get your voice and our family's voice and our community's voice to the decision makers. So we served as a conduit. We had districts that were doing surveys of how community felt about local decision, about masking, about vaccines. And we helped those school board members get through the gatekeepers and the stacks of inboxes to get to Department of Health and the governor's office. Did it make a difference? I don't know. But in the end, the locally elected school boards, they heard from their communities, and in many cases they agreed with them, but they knew that they needed to follow these rules, like school buses having to stop at crosswalks and maintenance workers having to wear steel-toed boots. But They advocated, and that's what WASDA does. We don't pass judgment. We're not proselytizing on federal requirements. Our job, we're the coach. So if a local school board hears from their community that they want to change and they want more of a local say in something, we stand ready to help them connect with their legislators to advocate to the decision maker. So we're not yelling at the mailman because we don't like the speed limit.
Thank you, Tim. Many thanks to Lee Finna and Tim Garshow for a very interesting program. Wow. So